A heartless millionaire abandoned his newborn son because he was deaf and mute. He and even you did not expect that later that boy would return, and the cold winter morning marked the beginning of a family tragedy that would leave scars for decades. He sat with his head in his hands, praying for the first time in years. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Bennett," the doctor said with a trembling voice. "We did everything we could to save your wife, but the complications were just too severe." Matthew felt the ground beneath him collapse. "And the baby?" he managed to ask in a faint voice. "Your son survived," the doctor said, hesitating briefly. "But he was born with a special condition. He's deaf and mute." In the weeks that followed, Matthew sank into a deep depression. The mansion, once filled with the warmth and laughter of Lauren, now felt like a tomb haunted by painful memories. The baby's cries echoed through the halls, a constant reminder of what he'd lost. Teresa, the housekeeper, tried her best to care for the newborn, but Matthew couldn't bring himself to look at the child without feeling a sharp pang in his chest. "Sir," Teresa said one morning, holding baby Samuel gently, "your son needs you. Lauren would want you to take care of him." Her voice quivered as she tried to reason with him. Matthew looked at her with bloodshot eyes. "Don't mention her name," he whispered darkly. "This child took her from me. I can't even look at him without thinking of her." Scott, Matthew's personal assistant, watched the situation unfold with growing concern. "Sir," he cautiously suggested one day, "perhaps we should explore other options. There are excellent facilities that specialize in caring for children." Matthew looked up from his desk, a flicker of interest crossing his face for the first time in weeks. "What kind of facilities?" he asked in a hoarse voice. The decision was made hastily, too quickly for anyone to intervene. On a dreary morning, Matthew ordered Teresa to prepare the baby. "We're going for a drive," he said coldly, avoiding her pleading gaze. Teresa held Samuel tightly, her heart heavy with a sense of impending doom. "Please, sir, reconsider this," Teresa pleaded, but her words were met with silence. The car ride was silent and tense. Matthew stared out the window as Scott drove toward the outskirts of the city. Samuel slept peacefully in his car seat, blissfully unaware of what awaited him. Teresa had cried as she said goodbye, but Matthew had forbidden her from interfering under threat of dismissal. The bustling cityscape gave way to quieter, more remote areas. The orphanage was a worn brick building surrounded by an overgrown garden. A middle-aged woman with a kind but stern expression greeted them at the door. "Good morning. How can I help you?" she asked, her eyes quickly settling on the baby. Matthew maintained his cold demeanor as Scott explained the situation. "I don't have the patience to raise a child like this," Matthew said curtly, signing the papers relinquishing custody. "It's better this way, for everyone." The woman, Mrs. Rosemary, clenched her fists, struggling to hold back her anger. "Mr. Bennett, your son is not a burden. He's a child who needs love," she said, trying to reason with him. "My decision is final," Matthew replied flatly, handing the baby to Mrs. Rosemary. Samuel woke up at that moment and, seeing his father walking away, stretched out his tiny arms toward him. His wide, tear-filled eyes pleaded silently, a heartbreaking sight as he tried to reach for the man leaving him behind. Matthew had already turned around, walking decisively toward the exit. Mrs. Rosemary cradled the baby close to her chest, rocking him gently as tears streamed down her face. "It's okay, little one," she whispered, knowing full well that Samuel couldn't hear her. "I'll take care of you," she promised, watching as the black car disappeared down the gravel path, carrying away the man who had just committed one of the cruelest acts she had ever witnessed during her years at the orphanage. Inside the car, Scott glanced at his boss through the rearview mirror. "Are you certain about this, sir?" he asked cautiously. "There's nothing more to discuss," Matthew snapped, his voice as cold as the winter wind outside. "That chapter of my life is over. Let's focus on business." But his clenched fists resting on his knees betrayed the inner turmoil he was desperately trying to suppress. Back at the orphanage, the days that followed were tough. Samuel cried incessantly, as if he somehow understood he had been abandoned. Mrs. Rosemary spent sleepless nights rocking the little boy, humming lullabies he couldn't hear, but whose vibrations seemed to soothe him. "This child is special," she confided to her colleague Kathleen. "I can see it in his eyes. There's a strength in him that his father never recognized." Meanwhile, at the mansion, Teresa quietly gathered up the baby's belongings. Every tiny outfit and every unused toy served as a painful reminder of the harsh fate that had befallen little Samuel. "Lauren would never have let this happen," she murmured as she packed everything into boxes. Matthew overheard her from the hallway, but chose to remain silent. That night, he ordered all the boxes to be donated, refusing to allow any reminders to linger in the house. Winter arrived with unrelenting force, and as snow blanketed the orphanage grounds, Samuel began to adjust to his new reality. Mrs. Rosemary marveled at the boy's keen awareness of his surroundings, despite his quiet demeanor. "It's as though his other senses are making up for what he can't hear," she often remarked to her co-workers. During this time, Matthew threw himself deeper into his work, expanding his construction company with an almost obsessive drive. Meetings piled up, contracts flooded in, and his name began to echo in the upper echelons of the business world. "Work is all that matters," he frequently reminded Scott, who grew increasingly concerned about his boss's growing coldness and detachment. At the orphanage, Mrs. Rosemary started noticing extraordinary traits in Samuel. The baby responded strongly to vibrations and light, his eyes intently following movement with remarkable focus for his age. "This boy has a gift for sensing the world in his own way," she explained to Kathleen as they watched Samuel's gaze fix on the rustling leaves outside in the garden. As the months passed, Teresa began visiting the orphanage more frequently, though always in secret. "How's the young man doing?" Mrs. Rosemary would ask whenever she saw Teresa. "He's growing more distant every day," Teresa would reply somberly. Matthew had removed all of Lauren's pictures from the house, as if erasing the past could make it disappear entirely. As they spoke, Samuel crawled across the floor, blissfully unaware of the conversations about his father. The nights in the mansion were especially haunting. Matthew often found himself wandering the empty hallways, chased by memories he couldn't escape. Sometimes he would pause in front of the room that was supposed to have been Samuel's nursery, but he could never bring himself to open the door. The silence in the house seemed to mock him, a constant reminder of the laughter he'd never hear. "Sir," Scott ventured one day, "I've heard the orphanage is doing a fine job with the boy." Matthew shot him a piercing glare. "Don't ever bring up that topic again," he snapped. "That chapter is closed and buried." Yet that night, for the first time since Samuel's abandonment, Matthew dreamt of the boy. He pictured him growing up without a father to guide him. Meanwhile, Mrs. Rosemary began documenting every little milestone Samuel reached in a journal. "One day, I want you to know your full story," she wrote, knowing it would be years before Samuel could truly understand. She recorded his first smiles, his attempts to communicate through gestures, and the sparkle in his eyes whenever something caught his attention. One day, as Matthew sorted through paperwork in his office, he stumbled upon a hospital bill from the day Samuel was born. For a fleeting moment, his cold demeanor cracked, and his hands trembled as he held the document. "Lauren," he whispered in the solitude of his office, "what have I done?" but in an instant he regained his composure, shoved the paper into a drawer, and returned to work. Back at the orphanage, Samuel's first wobbly steps were celebrated by the entire staff. Mrs. Rosemary shed tears of joy as she watched Samuel shuffle from one piece of furniture to another, determined to stand independently. "He has his mother's willpower," Teresa remarked, having arrived just in time to witness the moment. "And his father's stubbornness," Mrs. Rosemary added, her voice tinged with a mix of sorrow and hope. And so, Samuel's first year at the orphanage unfolded, marking the beginning of a story filled with both hardship and resilience. While Mrs. Rosemary cared for him with unwavering love and Teresa quietly watched over him, Matthew rose to greater power, though his success felt increasingly hollow. The decision he made on that bitter winter morning had set both father and son on separate paths. Only time would tell if their lives would intersect again. As the years passed, Samuel, now 6 years old, faced the daily struggles of being different. His inability to speak or hear made him an easy target for bullying. Carlos, one of the older boys, had become his main tormentor, leading a group that found amusement in teasing the mute, as they cruelly called him. "Look, there goes the mute!" Carlos would yell during breakfast. Samuel, sitting alone in a corner of the dining hall, kept his eyes glued to his plate, gripping his spoon so tightly his knuckles turned white. Mrs. Rosemary watched from a distance, her heart aching, knowing that stepping in too often would only make things worse. Life at the orphanage followed a rigid routine. Samuel woke up earlier than the other children to avoid them in the shared bathrooms. During lessons, he sat at the very back of the classroom, trying to stay invisible while Ms. Kathleen, his teacher, made every effort to include him in the activities. Using gestures and drawings to communicate, Kathleen emphasized in staff meetings, "He needs special help." She firmly believed Samuel was bright. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he observed and absorbed everything around him. "He just needs a chance," she insisted. But Mrs. Rosemary, the head of the orphanage, often sighed at the limited resources and the lack of sign language instructors in the area. Nights were particularly lonely for Samuel. While the other kids swapped stories and laughed in their bunks, Samuel stayed awake, staring at the moon through the window. Sometimes he would pull out a tattered notebook Mrs. Rosemary had given him, using it to sketch out the thoughts and feelings he couldn't put into words, his fears, his dreams, his solitude. "What are you drawing?" Carlos asked one day, snatching the notebook from his hands. "These are just scribbles." His friends laughed as Samuel desperately tried to reclaim his cherished notebook. The scuffle left him with a black eye, and his notebook ended up ruined, its pages soaked in the rain on the playground. Later that evening, Mrs. Rosemary found Samuel drenched and silently sobbing as he tried to gather the ruined pieces. "Oh, my sweet boy," she whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. Though he couldn't hear her words, he could feel the warmth and comfort in her arms. That night, she gave him a sturdier notebook, bigger and better than the last. It wasn't long before Kathleen began to notice Samuel's hidden talent for art. Despite their simplicity, Samuel's drawings conveyed profound emotions that exceeded the power of words. "Look at this," Kathleen said to Mrs. Rosemary, holding up one of Samuel's sketches. It depicted a family beneath a tree, with a small boy surrounded by what seemed like angels. "He's drawing his mother," Mrs. Rosemary murmured, her eyes brimming with tears. Meanwhile, Teresa's secret visits to the orphanage became less frequent as the years went by. "Your fathers built an empire," Teresa confided to Mrs. Rosemary during one of her visits, watching Samuel play alone in the yard. "But every time I see him, I notice something missing in his eyes, something no business success can fill. Unaware of these conversations, Samuel continued his quiet routine, finding solace in his art and the kindness of those who truly cared for him. Despite the many challenges he faced, he developed a quiet resilience that amazed everyone around him. When the other kids pushed him down, he got back up without a word. When they ruined his drawings, he simply created better ones. Mrs. Rosemary observed how these experiences shaped him into a thoughtful, observant boy. On one particularly tough day during lunch, Carlos spilled soup all over Samuel. "Oops, didn't hear you ask me to move," he sneered, eliciting laughter from the others. Samuel calmly stood, cleaned himself as best he could, and, to everyone's surprise, offered a small smile before walking away. His unexpected reaction left Carlos so puzzled that he stopped bothering him for days. Joshua, the orphanage's handyman, also noticed Samuel. The boy often lingered near Joshua's workshop, watching intently as he repaired various items. "You want to learn?" Joshua asked one day, using gestures. Samuel eagerly nodded, and thus began a quiet but impactful mentorship. Under Joshua's guidance, Samuel's natural skill with his hands blossomed. Before long, he became known for fixing broken toys, a talent that began to shift how the other children viewed him. Some children even started coming to him when their toys needed fixing, using gestures and glances to communicate in simple ways. Mrs. Rosemary watched these changes with quiet joy. "He's finding his place," she remarked to Kathleen. "Despite everything he's endured, he's learning to connect with others in his own way." Kathleen reflected on Samuel's recent repair of the ancient classroom clock, which everyone had deemed irreparable. The nights weren't as lonely for Samuel anymore. Although he still couldn't join in conversations with the other kids, he had discovered a purpose in his new hobby. Sitting on his bed under the moonlight, he would disassemble and reassemble small mechanisms that Joshua let him take to his room, finding peace in the methodical rhythm of his work. One Sunday morning, while the children played outside, Teresa made one of her secret visits. This time, she brought significant news. "Matthew is engaged," she whispered to Mrs. Rosemary. "He's trying to rebuild his life." The two women glanced at Samuel, who was engrossed in repairing an old music box, oblivious to their conversation. Matthew's engagement seemed to signal a turning point in Teresa's visits. They became more sporadic until they eventually stopped altogether. "It's like she's trying to erase her past," Mrs. Rosemary reflected one evening as she tucked Samuel into bed. The boy, who had grown noticeably, no longer asked about the kind woman who used to bring him small gifts. Years passed, and by the time Samuel turned 8, he had developed a unique personality. Though he couldn't communicate verbally, he had an extraordinary ability to understand people's emotions through their expressions and gestures. He had become the silent confidant for many children at the orphanage, offering comfort through his calm and empathetic presence. Those years marked a pivotal period in Samuel's life. His talent for fixing broken things became a metaphor for his own journey. Despite being fractured by abandonment, he had found a way to rebuild himself and help others in the process. Mrs. Rosemary and Joshua exchanged proud glances as they watched the once abandoned boy grow into someone remarkable, as though fate had something greater in store for him. Everything changed one spring morning when Melissa arrived at the orphanage. The art teacher, known for her work with special needs children, was immediately drawn to the quiet boy sketching in the corner of the yard. His drawings, though simple, carried an emotional depth she rarely saw in children his age. "Who is that boy?" Melissa asked Mrs. Rosemary, subtly gesturing toward Samuel. Mrs. Rosemary's eyes lit up as she replied, "That's Samuel, our special boy. He can't hear or speak, but he has an extraordinary gift for expressing himself through art." Melissa approached slowly, watching Samuel as he focused intently on his drawing. Their first meeting felt magical. She quietly sat next to him, pulled out her sketchbook, and began to draw. Samuel, curious, paused to observe Melissa's strokes. For the first time in a long while, someone was speaking to him in a language he could fully understand. Melissa started visiting the orphanage 3 times a week, bringing professional art supplies, colored pencils, watercolors, brushes, and small canvases. Samuel eagerly absorbed every new technique with astonishing speed. Samuel's drawings began to take on a new life, evolving from simple sketches to vibrant works brimming with emotion. His weekly art sessions quickly became the highlight of his days. Melissa not only taught him drawing techniques, but also found innovative ways to connect with him through art. Together, they developed a unique language of colors and shapes, where every stroke carried a deeper meaning. "It's extraordinary," Melissa shared with Mrs. Rosemary as they reviewed Samuel's progress. "His inability to communicate verbally has heightened his ability to express himself through art. Each piece he created became a window into his soul." Mrs. Rosemary felt immense gratitude that someone else could finally see the brilliance she'd always recognized in Samuel. The other children in the orphanage began to see him differently too. Their teasing lessened as they noticed the renowned art teacher dedicating so much time to him. Even Carlos, his former bully, began showing interest in Samuel's work, though he would never admit it openly. Samuel's drawings started to decorate the orphanage walls. Each one told a story: portraits of his peers, scenes of daily life, and recurring images of a winged woman whom everyone believed represented his mother. Mrs. Rosemary carefully archived each piece, preserving a record of his artistic journey. One day, Melissa arrived with exciting news. "I want to organize a small exhibit featuring Samuel's work," she announced. "People need to see his talent." At first, Mrs. Rosemary hesitated, worried about exposing Samuel to the outside world. But Melissa's determination and the boy's enthusiasm eventually won her over. The preparations for the exhibit turned into a collaborative project involving the entire orphanage. Samuel poured himself into creating new works, while the other children helped frame his drawings and set up the space. Melissa took charge of inviting prominent figures in the art and special education communities. Word of the exhibit even reached Teresa, who hadn't visited the orphanage in months. When she arrived one afternoon and saw Samuel's progress, tears welled up in her eyes. "If only his father could see this," she whispered to Mrs. Rosemary. "Matthew is so blinded by ambition that he can't recognize his son's extraordinary talent." The day of the exhibit arrived with great anticipation. The orphanage's main hall had been transformed into a cozy art gallery. Samuel's works, arranged in chronological order, showcased his evolution from simple doodles to breathtaking pieces that captured the essence of human emotion. Visitors were not only amazed by Samuel's artistic skills, but also moved by his story. "It's remarkable how this child has found his voice through art," a local critic remarked. Samuel, dressed in his finest clothes, stood shyly in a corner, tightly holding Melissa's hand as he observed people's reactions. One particularly moving moment occurred when a visiting family stopped in front of one of Samuel's most poignant drawings, a small boy reaching out to a figure walking away. "This drawing tells such a powerful story," the mother commented, unaware that it depicted the most painful moment in Samuel's life. Inspired by the exhibit's success, Melissa presented a bold proposal to the orphanage's board. "Samuel needs access to specialized education," she argued passionately. With the funds raised from selling some of the artworks, they were able to hire a sign language instructor and purchase professional art supplies. Samuel's life began to take a dramatic turn after the art exhibition. Not only did he start receiving sign language lessons, but Melissa also secured scholarships from a prestigious art institute for children with special needs. Samuel would be the very first to benefit from this program. Joshua, who had witnessed Samuel's transformation firsthand, set up a small studio in a corner of the warehouse. "This will be your space," he conveyed, using the basic sign language he had recently learned. Samuel responded with a heartfelt hug, his truest way of expressing gratitude. The final days of that year marked a turning point in Samuel's life. He was no longer just the deaf and mute child from the orphanage. He was now an emerging artist, someone who had discovered his purpose. Ms. Rosemary carefully preserved a clipping from the local newspaper covering the exhibition, hoping that one day Samuel could share his success with those who had once abandoned him. While Samuel found his path through art, Matthew Bennett had risen to become one of the most powerful players in the construction industry. His company, Bennett Constructions, dominated the market with increasingly ambitious projects. Sitting in his top-floor office, Matthew reviewed financial reports with a satisfied smile. "Mr. Bennett, the shareholders are waiting," his secretary announced. The boardroom was filled with men in expensive suits, all eager to hear the latest expansion plans. Scott, his trusted right-hand man, prepared the presentation with a confident smile that masked darker intentions. "Our profits have tripled this quarter," Matthew announced proudly. "But that's not enough. I want Bennett Constructions to become the largest company in the country." The shareholders applauded enthusiastically, while Scott silently took mental notes for his own gain. One afternoon, Scott entered Matthew's office with an enticing proposal. "Sir, I've found a way to significantly boost our profit margins." His plan was simple but risky, cutting the quality of building materials without informing clients. "Are you sure this won't cause any issues?" Matthew asked, though his tone suggested the decision had already been made. "Completely certain, sir," Scott replied with a calculated smile. "By the time anyone notices, the profits will be massive." Matthew's personal life was as cold and uninviting as his sleek glass and steel office. He had remarried a high society woman named Victoria, but their marriage was more of a strategic alliance than a relationship built on love. Dinner conversations were sparse, broken only by the clinking of silverware against fine porcelain. Teresa, who still worked at the mansion, watched with sadness as her employer had become a completely different man. The photos of Lauren had long since disappeared, and no one dared to bring up the past. "He lives in a gilded cage," Teresa remarked one day to the cook. Construction projects multiplied across the city, apartment towers, shopping malls, office buildings, all bearing the Bennett Constructions logo. Matthew spent countless hours in his office, gazing out at his growing empire, oblivious to the early signs of trouble. Mason, a seasoned employee in the quality control department, started noticing discrepancies in the materials. "This doesn't sit right," he confided to a colleague during lunch. The materials being used didn't meet safety standards. Both men knew that reporting this to management would likely cost them their jobs. Rumors about shady practices at Bennett Construction started to ripple through the industry. Competitors and journalists began asking probing questions about how the company managed to complete projects so quickly and at such surprisingly low costs. Matthew brushed off these concerns with the kind of arrogance only power can provide. Scott, his indispensable right-hand man, was tasked with handling the company's more questionable dealings. "Boss, I've got the inspectors looking the other way," Scott would report, carefully omitting the bribes and threats he used to achieve this. Matthew didn't bother asking for details. Victoria, Matthew's new wife, began noticing troubling changes in her husband. "You barely sleep. You hardly eat," she'd scold during heated arguments. "It's nothing but work, work, and more work." Matthew ignored her, consumed by stacks of documents and endless phone calls, even during meals. Cracks, both figurative and literal, started to show in the empire. A newly completed building revealed its first signs of structural damage. "It's nothing serious," Scott assured the board. "Just some minor issues we can fix with a little cosmetic work." But it was only the beginning. At their mansion, Teresa, the housekeeper, kept a silent watch over her employer as his ambition consumed him. One evening, while cleaning Matthew's study, she stumbled upon an old photograph of Samuel hidden in a drawer. She quickly tucked it away when she heard footsteps approaching, but the discovery left her deeply unsettled. Meanwhile, whispers of discontent spread among lower-level employees. "Have you seen the safety reports?" they murmured in hushed tones. "They're falsifying them." But fear of Matthew's power and Scott's influence kept them silent. Tensions grew at board meetings. Senior shareholders voiced concerns about the company's aggressive expansion strategy. "We're growing too fast," they warned. Matthew silenced them with promises of bigger dividends and overly optimistic projections. One day, while overseeing a construction site, Matthew had a rare moment of introspection. Observing the workers, Matthew momentarily reminisced about his own humble beginnings. "What have I become?" he wondered. The thought vanished as quickly as it had come, buried under the weight of new contracts and pressing deadlines. The press, however, began digging deeper. A relentless journalist started asking tough questions about material quality and labor practices. Scott took charge of handling the situation, but the questions kept piling up. Matthew began to visibly suffer from the mounting pressure. Sleepless nights became routine, and his once icy demeanor grew volatile. After one particularly heated argument with Victoria about his obsessive work habits, she packed her bags and left, leaving behind only a note. "You've become a monster." Sensing Matthew's vulnerability, Scott seized the opportunity to strengthen his own grip on the company. "No worries, sir," Scott would constantly assure. "I'll take care of everything." Without realizing it, Matthew was gradually surrendering more and more control to his cunning assistant. Unexpectedly, the first major disaster occurred. A newly constructed apartment building began showing alarming cracks. Residents were evacuated in the middle of the night, and by morning, devastating images flooded the news. Matthew's empire was beginning to crumble. "This is impossible," Matthew roared during an emergency meeting. "Everything was supposed to be under control." Scott remained unusually quiet as engineers presented detailed reports revealing structural failures caused by substandard materials. Within days, more projects began showing similar issues. The media tore into the company relentlessly, shareholders demanded answers, and clients filed multi-million-dollar lawsuits. The empire Matthew had so carefully built was collapsing before his eyes, just like the poorly constructed buildings. Meanwhile, Teresa watched silently from the shadows of the mansion, thinking about little Samuel and how her boss's unbridled ambition had led to this point. "Money and power can't fill the emptiness of the soul," she murmured to herself, dusting yet another empty room. Matthew's days as the CEO of Bennett Constructions were numbered, though he didn't know it yet. His empire wasn't falling because of outside forces, but because of the corruption he had allowed to flourish under his watch, blinded by ambition and the pursuit of power. "Sir," Scott said, in what would be their final private meeting, "the shareholders have called for an extraordinary meeting." His tone was different this time, almost triumphant. Matthew, sunk deep into his leather chair, stared out the office window, gazing at the city he once believed was his. The man who had sacrificed everything for power, even his relationship with his own son, was about to face his ultimate downfall. The extraordinary shareholder meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. The corporate headquarters of Bennett Constructions buzzed with unusual activity. Journalists crowded the entrance, while rumors of Matthew Bennett's impending demise swirled on every floor. "The results of the investigation are conclusive," the board chairman announced. "The materials used in our last 20 projects failed to meet minimum safety standards." Matthew, seated at the end of the table, kept his face expressionless as his world crumbled around him. Scott, surprisingly, spoke up. "As Chief Operating Officer, I must report that all these decisions were approved by Mr. Bennett." The betrayal, though anticipated by some, landed like a brutal blow. The room buzzed with murmurs as Matthew clenched his fists under the table. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents, emails, and doctored invoices all pointed to a systematic corruption scheme. "We didn't just endanger lives," a senior shareholder declared. "We've destroyed this company's reputation." The media received detailed leaks about the scandal. "Empire of Lies, the fraud behind Bennett Constructions," headlined the newspapers. The company's stock plummeted within hours, taking Matthew's personal fortune with it. Victoria, who had returned briefly to gather her remaining belongings, found Matthew in his study. "I warned you," she said simply, before walking out for good. The sound of her heels echoing down the hallway marked the definitive end of their marriage. From the kitchen, Teresa watched as her boss sank deeper into his own misery. One morning, Matthew heard a bold suggestion from an assistant. "Sir, perhaps this is an opportunity to—" But before the sentence could be completed, Matthew erupted, silencing them with a roar. He couldn't bear advice or consolation. Meanwhile, demands from every corner flooded in. A relentless wave from apartment owners, investors, and contractors, all demanding compensation. Matthew's legal team warned him that his position was untenable. Personal bankruptcy loomed. Scott, on the other hand, had vanished, taking a significant sum from the company. Investigations uncovered that he'd been plotting his exit for months, securing offshore accounts and safeguarding his future. Let us know you're listening to this part of the story by leaving a tomato comment below. Thank you so much. During a desperate board meeting, Matthew made a weak attempt to defend his leadership, claiming, "Everything I did was for the company's good." The looks of contempt and pity he received stung more than any verbal attack. News of his downfall even reached the orphanage. As Mrs. Rosemary read the morning paper, she let out a heavy sigh. Samuel, now a teenager, noticed her unease, but couldn't imagine the headlines were about his own father. Matthew began selling off his possessions one by one. His mansion, luxury cars, and prized artwork, all liquidated to settle the mounting claims. Through it all, Teresa remained loyal, refusing to leave, even when Matthew couldn't pay her salary. Longtime employees began speaking out. "He was always like this," one supervisor told investigators. "Mr. Bennett would sacrifice anything for power, even his own son." Samuel's name started appearing in media reports, threatening to reveal secrets Matthew had fought to keep buried. One particularly grim night, he found himself leafing through old photos stored in a safe. Among them was the last picture of Lauren and a blurry image of Samuel as a baby. The alcohol in his system couldn't numb the weight of his resurfacing regrets. Authorities launched a criminal investigation. The charges were severe: fraud, criminal negligence, forgery. Matthew watched as his once celebrated name became synonymous with greed and corruption. One morning, Teresa found him passed out in his study, surrounded by empty bottles and scattered papers. Among the mess were drawings Samuel had made as a child in the orphanage, which Teresa had quietly preserved over the years. The final blow came in the form of a letter. The board of directors had unanimously voted to remove Matthew from all positions within the company. The formal notice was cold and unceremonious, devoid of any mention of his years of service or past achievements. It marked the definitive end of his reign. Isolation became his constant companion. Those who once flattered him now avoided eye contact on the street. His phone stopped ringing, invitations disappeared, and the silence in his empty home became deafening. The empire he had built had transformed into his prison. The press reported daily on new revelations of corruption at Bennett Construction. Matthew couldn't step outside without being recognized and condemned. Restaurants that once competed for his presence now turned him away at the door. In the midst of his downfall, Matthew began having recurring dreams of Lauren and Samuel. In these visions, his wife gazed at him with disappointment, cradling their son in her arms. Was it worth it? Her eyes seemed to ask silently. He would wake up drenched in sweat, haunted by the ghosts of his past choices. The mansion, the last remnant of his former glory, had to be sold. Teresa, tears welling in her eyes, packed up the final belongings of her employer. "Sir," she whispered, "there's always a chance to make things right." For the first time in years, Matthew couldn't keep up his facade of cold indifference. The lawyers had informed him that everything was lost. The lawsuits had drained his finances, and the criminal investigation was moving forward relentlessly. "I recommend cooperating with the authorities," his lawyer advised. "It's your only chance to avoid prison." One afternoon, as he wandered through the streets of the city he once ruled, Matthew stopped in front of an art gallery. In the window, a striking painting caught his eye, a lonely child standing under a stormy sky. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a reflection of his abandoned son in the image. Matthew's final days in his crumbled empire were filled with solitude and bitterness. Sitting alone in a dingy hotel room, he stared out at the city lights that no longer belonged to him. The man who had sacrificed everything for power now had nothing left. Teresa, in a last act of loyalty, handed him an envelope filled with photographs and clippings she had saved over the years. "Maybe it's time to remember what truly matters," she said before leaving. Among the images was one of Samuel at the orphanage, a painful reminder of Matthew's greatest sin. The final chapter of Matthew Bennett's fall unfolded at dawn. Headlines announced that the company he had built was being taken over by a new owner. He was unaware that fate had one final surprise in store for him, one that would upend the very foundation of his existence. The remaining traces of his empire faded like morning mist. Matthew Bennett, once a powerful businessman, had become a shadow of himself, a living testament to how unchecked ambition can destroy not just fortunes, but also souls. Tension filled the air on the day of the company's takeover. Shareholders and executives gathered in the main boardroom, eager to meet the mysterious buyer who had acquired the majority of shares. Matthew, required to attend as part of the transition, sat in a corner, a hollow version of his former self. The murmurs ceased as the doors swung open. A sharply dressed young man strode into the room with purpose. His presence commanded immediate attention, but it was his identity that left everyone stunned. "Good morning," he said firmly. "I'm Samuel Bennett, your new CEO." Matthew's face turned ashen as he recognized the confident and successful man standing before him as the boy he had abandoned years ago. Memories of the orphanage, the tears of young Samuel, and his own heartless choices flooded through him. Matthew's hands began trembling uncontrollably. "As you can see from the reports in front of you," Samuel continued with professionalism, "I have a clear plan for restructuring the company." His words were precise, but his eyes, when they met Matthew's, held years of restrained pain. Samuel's plan was meticulous. He outlined a comprehensive strategy to restore the company's reputation, new quality standards, complete transparency in operations, and compensation for those harmed by faulty constructions. The shareholders nodded in agreement, impressed by his vision. "But there's one more thing," Samuel announced, locking eyes with Matthew. Those responsible for the corrupt practices of the past will be held accountable. The room fell into a deafening silence, starting with the former president, Matthew Bennett. Matthew attempted to speak, but his words became stuck in his throat. He stood up hesitantly, attempting to salvage a shred of dignity. "Samuel, he began, but his son interrupted him with a firm gesture. "Mr. Bennett, to you, I am Mr. Samuel," he said coldly. "You lost the right to call me your son a long time ago." The meeting proceeded with Samuel outlining immediate changes in the company's leadership. Every decision and new appointment further undermined the empire that Matthew had built. Every announcement was met with applause from the shareholders, while Matthew sank deeper into his chair. The most devastating moment came when Samuel presented documents that proved Matthew's direct involvement in all the fraudulent activities. "As you can see," Samuel said, his voice measured and calm, "none of this was accidental. Every decision that endangered human lives was deliberate and approved at the highest level." Matthew's former allies avoided his gaze as Samuel continued to reveal the company's sordid truth. "For years," Samuel declared, "this company operated on a foundation of greed and corruption. Today, that ends." Every word hit like a dagger, aimed not just at the corrupt practices, but also at the man who had once been his father. "Mr. Bennett," Samuel announced, his tone icy and formal, "you are officially dismissed from all your roles at Bennett Constructions." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on Matthew, awaiting his reaction. But he just sat there, defeated, unable to meet his son's piercing gaze. The transformation was striking. Samuel, the mute child Matthew once saw as a burden, now stood tall as a respected leader. Despite his unique way of communicating, using a combination of sign language and a professional interpreter, Samuel commanded the room with clarity and authority. "Compensation for the victims will begin immediately," he continued. "This will include the liquidation of all Mr. Bennett's personal assets." Matthew felt the final remnants of his wealth slip away, but the harshest blow was the poetic justice of having his own son deliver his downfall. The shareholders unanimously approved Samuel's proposals. One by one, they voiced their trust in his leadership. "It's refreshing to see integrity and compassion in this boardroom," one senior member remarked, casting a pointed glance at Matthew. When the meeting ended, Samuel walked out without looking back. In a last-ditch effort, Matthew called out, "Son, please." Samuel paused for a moment, his back straight, but he didn't turn around. The message was clear. Some doors were closed forever. As Matthew gathered his belongings from the office he once ruled, employees watched in stunned silence. Some whispered about the irony of fate, others murmured about divine justice. Meanwhile, Samuel was already in meetings with his new leadership team, enacting immediate reforms. Teresa, whom Samuel had invited to witness the transition, stood quietly in the corner, tears streaming down her face. Years of pain and secrecy had culminated in this moment. She watched as Samuel, now a confident and successful man, strode through the halls with the same determination he had once shown in his childhood drawings. The story of an abandoned son returning to save his father's company quickly caught the attention of the media. Headlines highlighted not only the dramatic turn of events, but also Samuel's inspiring journey of resilience. For the first time, Matthew learned about his son's achievements through the newspapers, uncovering a life of success he had chosen to ignore. "My father left me because he saw me as a burden," Samuel shared in an interview using sign language. "But every obstacle made me stronger. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to seek justice and redemption for this company." His interpreter's translation carried a weight that Matthew had never imagined his son capable of expressing. Over the next few weeks, the transfer of power brought sweeping changes. Samuel introduced groundbreaking policies, enhanced safety protocols, transparent audits, and robust compensation programs. Under his leadership, the company, once synonymous with corruption, began its transformation into a beacon of corporate integrity. Employees immediately noticed the shift in workplace culture. Despite his condition, Samuel communicated more effectively than his father ever had. He launched a company-wide sign language program, fostering a culture of inclusion and mutual respect. Melissa, the art teacher who had recognized Samuel's talent at the orphanage, was appointed director of the company's new foundation, dedicated to supporting children with disabilities. "I'll never forget where I came from," Samuel said during the foundation's inauguration. "Now I use my success to lift others." Mrs. Rosemary, invited as an honored guest, couldn't hold back her tears as she watched Samuel lead an executive meeting. Speaking in sign language, she told him, "I always knew you were special, but you've surpassed all my dreams for you." Meanwhile, Matthew retreated to a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. Each morning, he read about his son's accomplishments in the papers, overwhelmed by a bittersweet mix of pride and regret. With every new success, the gravity of his decision to abandon Samuel weighed heavier on him. The final days of the transition were the hardest. Samuel ordered a comprehensive audit of all decisions made during his father's tenure, exposing years of mismanagement and corruption. Each revelation served as a stark reminder of the toxic legacy Matthew had left behind. The company's offices underwent a complete transformation, both physically and symbolically. Portraits of Matthew were replaced with artwork created by children with disabilities. The message was clear: a new era of inclusion, integrity, and purpose had begun. The story culminated in a powerful image: Samuel standing in his father's former office, gazing out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. In his hands, he held an old drawing he had made at the orphanage, showing a young boy reaching for the stars. That dream had finally come true. In the days that followed, Matthew experienced the full impact of his downfall. His luxurious apartment was replaced by a humble home, far from the bustling city he once commanded. His mornings, once packed with meetings and critical decisions, now stretched out in silence. Teresa, loyal to the end, offered to stay by his side. But Matthew declined. "Go, Teresa," he said, with a voice stripped of its former arrogance. "Find a job with someone who deserves your loyalty." For the first time in years, he showed genuine consideration for someone else. News of Samuel's achievements as head of the company reached Matthew daily. Each headline was a painful reminder of all he had lost, not just his company, but the chance to watch his son grow into the remarkable man he had become. The photographs of Samuel featured in business magazines depicted a respected leader, admired for his integrity and vision. One day, while aimlessly wandering the city streets, Matthew found himself standing in front of a local church. The sound of children's laughter caught his attention. It was a community kitchen where volunteers served meals to families in need. Something about those laughs reminded him of the Samuel he had left behind. "Can I help with anything?" he asked a volunteer hesitantly. The woman, not recognizing him, smiled warmly and handed him an apron. "We can always use an extra pair of hands," she said. For the first time in decades, Matthew found himself serving others instead of being served. His days at the community kitchen soon became a routine. Once a construction tycoon, Matthew learned how to peel potatoes, wash dishes, and serve meals. The people who came to the kitchen had no idea who he was, and in that anonymity, he discovered an unexpected solace. Among the children who frequented the kitchen, Matthew met Martin, a 9-year-old boy who painfully reminded him of Samuel. "My mum passed away," Martin shared one day, "and my grandma is really sick." Matthew's hardened heart resonated with the boy's story. Volunteering began to spark a change deep within him. the grateful smiles of the families, the stories of struggle and survival. They revealed a world Matthew had ignored in his relentless pursuit of power and wealth. Every day, he learned new lessons in humility and compassion. One afternoon, while organizing donations, he came across a box filled with art supplies. The colored pencils and sketch pads brought back bittersweet memories of Samuel's drawings, which Teresa had carefully kept for years. With tears in his eyes, Matthew decided to set up a small art corner for the children in the kitchen. Martin became one of its most frequent visitors. "You know, my grandma can't afford colored pencils," Martin confided one day while drawing. The boy's story, so similar yet so different from Samuel's, stirred something profound in Matthew's heart. That evening, he used what little savings he had to buy art supplies for Martin. Word of Matthew's work at the community kitchen eventually reached Samuel through Teresa, who kept tabs on her former employer. "He's changed," she told Samuel during a visit. "The man we knew doesn't exist anymore." Samuel listened quietly, his expression unreadable as he processed her words. The other volunteers observed Matthew's transformation. The woman who had first handed him the apron, Karina, observed how the once reserved, sorrowful man gradually changed. "There's a light in his eyes when he works with the kids," she remarked to her colleagues. One morning, while helping Martin with a drawing, the boy asked him, "Do you have kids?" The question struck Matthew deeply. After a long pause, he replied, "Yes, but I made a terrible mistake with him." It was the first time he openly admitted his guilt. His work in the kitchen became a path to personal redemption. Matthew began applying his management skills to improve the kitchen's operations. He introduced more efficient donation systems, better schedules for volunteers, and sought out new resources. One afternoon, while cleaning tables after a meal service, Matthew found an abandoned newspaper. In the business section, an article highlighted how Samuel had launched a corporate social responsibility program at Bennett Construction, focused on supporting community kitchens. Matthew couldn't escape the irony. Martin's grandmother fell gravely ill, and Matthew found himself stepping in to help the family navigate the complexities of the public healthcare system. Drawing on the last of his connections, he managed to secure proper medical care, feeling for the first time the fulfillment of using his remaining influence to assist others rather than himself. As winter approached, the soup kitchen saw an influx of families in need. Matthew worked tirelessly, arriving early and staying late into the night. One evening, as he locked up the building, he realized this was the first time he truly felt useful in his entire life. Karina, noticing the changes in him, asked one day, "Why do you keep coming back here?" Matthew glanced at the kids playing in the art corner before replying, "Because I'm learning what it really means to be human, something I should have understood a long time ago." His transformation reached its peak when he organized a modest art fair to showcase the children's drawings. The event, though small, garnered attention from the local community. The children, beaming with pride as they displayed their artwork, painfully reminded Matthew of Samuel's artistic talent, something he had failed to acknowledge in the past. During the fair, a local journalist approached Matthew for a story about the soup kitchen. Unaware of his identity, she asked about his work with the kids. "Each of them has a unique gift," he said, his voice faltering as he thought of Samuel. "They deserve someone who believes in them." Teresa unexpectedly appeared at the soup kitchen one day, surprising Matthew. "Samuel reads every report about this place," she told him. "He knows you're here." Matthew felt his heart stop for a moment. "He does?" he asked, his voice trembling. Teresa only offered a soft smile before leaving. When news broke that Martin's grandmother needed an expensive surgery, the entire soup kitchen community rallied together. In a final act of selflessness, Matthew sold his last luxury watch to contribute to the costs. "Why are you doing this for us?" Martin asked, confused. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," Matthew replied, thinking of his own son. That night, Matthew sat alone in his modest room, holding an old photograph of baby Samuel. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "I hope one day you can forgive me, my son. Not for my sake, but because forgiveness will set your heart free, just as helping others has freed mine." Matthew had settled into a new rhythm at the soup kitchen when he received a letter that would change everything. The envelope, bearing the logo of Bennett Construction, contained a brief note. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., main office, Samuel Bennett, CEO." His hands trembled as he read the words. The next morning, Matthew put on his only clean suit, now worn with age, and made his way to the building that had once been his empire, but now felt overwhelming. At the reception desk, a young woman, not recognizing him, looked at him with a mix of pity and curiosity as she announced his arrival. The elevator carried him to the top floor, where every corner held memories of his former life. The walls, once adorned with plaques commemorating his achievements, now displayed artwork created by children with disabilities. The transformation of the office perfectly mirrored the shift in leadership. Samuel stood by the window in what used to be Matthew's office. The contrast between father and son was stark. Samuel, polished and confident in his tailored suit. Matthew, aged and humbled in his frayed attire. The tension in the room was almost tangible. "Please summarize, Mr. Bennett," Samuel said through his interpreter. Matthew was struck by the formality of Samuel's words. Samuel went on, "I've been following your work at the community kitchen. Quite an interesting twist of fate, wouldn't you agree?" Matthew struggled to keep his composure as Samuel sifted through the documents on his desk. "I've read the reports about your efforts there," Samuel continued. "It seems you've finally realized there's more to life than power and money." Every word carried the weight of years of bottled-up pain. "Samuel, Matthew began, but his son cut him off with a firm gesture. "I didn't call you here to hear apologies," Samuel stated. "I called because the company's foundation is considering funding the community kitchen where you work." The revelation surprised Matthew. "Why?" Matthew managed to ask. Samuel finally met his eyes. "Because, unlike you, I don't let the past cloud my judgment. The kitchen does good work and deserves support, regardless of who works there." The conversation shifted to Samuel outlining the details of the community support program. Matthew listened in silence, impressed by his son's leadership and unwavering sense of justice. During the meeting, Samuel presented charts and slides showcasing the company's social impact under his leadership. "Every project now has a social responsibility component," he explained through signs, "something that was never prioritized during your tenure." The critique was subtle, but Matthew couldn't ignore it. He noticed the numerous awards Samuel had received in his short time at the helm, including one for integrating people with disabilities into the workforce. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Matthew. The son he had dismissed because of his condition was now a beacon of resilience and achievement. "I read about the boy helping at the kitchen," Samuel said. "Martin, right?" Matthew nodded, surprised. "His story reminded me of someone," Samuel added, his expression unreadable. The unspoken message made Matthew lower his gaze in shame. Teresa entered the office with some documents and paused briefly, observing father and son together after so many years. The air was so thick with tension, it was almost suffocating. Samuel signed the papers without looking up, while Matthew glanced at Teresa with a mixture of gratitude and regret. The meeting continued as they hashed out the details of the support program. Samuel maintained a strictly professional tone, but Matthew could sense the storm of emotions simmering beneath his calm demeanor. Every gesture, every glance, spoke of years of pain and absence. "The program will include art classes," Samuel explained. "I know from personal experience how therapeutic art can be for a child in pain." His words struck Matthew deeply, evoking memories of the drawings Samuel used to create at the orphanage. One particularly tense moment came when Samuel displayed photographs of his recent artwork. Matthew immediately recognized the same talent that Mrs. Rosemary had praised years ago. "I suppose I should thank you," Samuel said, his voice tinged with irony. Samuel's abandonment pushed me to find my voice through art. The golden glow of late afternoon was fading as Samuel finally wrapped up the meeting. "The funds will be transferred directly to the community kitchen," he explained. "You won't have access to them, for obvious reasons." Matthew nodded, acknowledging the lack of trust. As he rose to leave, he gathered the courage to ask one last question. Samuel maintained a strictly professional tone, but Matthew could sense the storm of emotions simmering beneath his calm demeanor. Every gesture, every glance spoke of years of pain and absence. "The program will include art classes," Samuel explained. "I know from personal experience how therapeutic art can be for a child in pain." His words struck Matthew deeply, evoking memories of the drawings Samuel used to create at the orphanage. One particularly tense moment came when Samuel displayed photographs of his recent artwork. Matthew immediately recognized the same talent that Mrs. Rosemary had praised years ago. "I suppose I should thank you," Samuel said, his voice tinged with irony. Samuel's abandonment pushed me to find my voice through art. The golden glow of late afternoon was fading as Samuel finally wrapped up the meeting. "The funds will be transferred directly to the community kitchen," he explained. "You won't have access to them, for obvious reasons." Matthew nodded, acknowledging the lack of trust. As he rose to leave, he gathered the courage to ask one last question. Matthew nodded, understanding that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be a slow process. Back at the community kitchen, Matthew found Martin drawing. The boy proudly showed off his latest piece, a picture of two people, one tall and one small, holding hands. "It's us," Martin explained with a smile. Tears threatened to fill Matthew's eyes. As night fell over the city, he walked back to his modest home, the lights of the Bennett construction building shining in the distance, a constant reminder of his past and the incredible person his son had become. The following days passed with a new sense of clarity. Every time Matthew helped a child at the kitchen or listened to stories of struggle and resilience, he gained a deeper understanding of Samuel's journey. His son hadn't just survived, he'd thrived. At the end of the week, a small package arrived for Matthew at the kitchen. Inside was a sketchbook and a note for the children. "Mr. A. Rosemary always said art heals the soul." It was the first personal gesture from Samuel, a small spark of hope. Fate, however, had planned a pivotal moment for father and son. On a cold winter morning, Samuel decided to visit the community kitchen to personally oversee the support program. He didn't inform anyone, not even Teresa, who had long been the silent bridge between them. Matthew was sitting in the art corner, helping Martin with a particularly intricate drawing, when the door opened. The sudden hush in the room made him look up. There stood Samuel, poised and as polished as ever, his expression unreadable. His interpreter was, as always, by his side. "Mr. Samuel," murmured Karina, the kitchen coordinator, immediately recognizing him from the news. "It's an honor to have you here." Samuel nodded politely, but his eyes were locked on the scene in front of him. His father, the former business magnate, sitting on the floor beside a child, surrounded by drawings and colored pencils. Oblivious to the moment, Martin proudly held up his drawing. "I made this!" he exclaimed with excitement. Samuel stepped closer, studying the drawing with genuine interest. It was a familiar scene, a child and an adult under a tree, much like the ones he used to sketch back at the orphanage. "This is really good," Samuel said through his interpreter, smiling warmly at the boy. Then, turning his gaze to Matthew, he added, "I see you've finally learned to appreciate children's art." Though spoken softly, his words carried the weight of decades of unresolved pain. Sensing the need for privacy, Karina quickly arranged an outdoor activity for the children. Soon the dining hall was empty, leaving only Samuel, Matthew, and the interpreter. The silence between them was almost deafening, filled with unspoken words and restrained emotions. "I've been watching the work you're doing here," Samuel began, his hands moving fluidly as he signed. "Teresa keeps me updated. She says you've changed." His eyes searched his father's aged face, looking for sincerity in his expression. Matthew drew a deep breath before responding. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Samuel. I don't deserve it. I'm just trying to be a better man than I was. Every day I spend here reminds me of the terrible mistake I made with you." Samuel's gaze wandered to the drawings on the walls, pausing at one depicting two figures embracing. "Ms. Rosemary kept all my drawings from the orphanage," he said. "Even the early ones, the ones I made right after you left me." His eyes met Matthew's. "They were all about you." Tears streamed down Matthew's face. "Not a day goes by that I don't regret what I did," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I saw you as a burden, an embarrassment, when you were actually a gift I failed to cherish. Seeing the man you've become now only makes my failure more glaring." Samuel sat at one of the dining tables, gesturing for his father to join him. "For years," he signed, "I poured all my pain into my art. Every drawing was a way to scream what I couldn't say out loud. Ms. Rosemary was the first to realize my silence wasn't a weakness, but a different form of expression. Life has a strange way of teaching lessons," Samuel continued. "You left me because of my condition, but that very condition became my greatest strength. While you were building skyscrapers, I was learning how to build bridges between people." Matthew absorbed every translated word, as if they were water quenching a long thirst. "When I saw you in the boardroom for the first time," he admitted, "I felt both pride and shame. Pride in the man you've become, and shame for not being there to help you along the way." "The other day," Samuel said, "I went back to the orphanage. Ms. Rosemary is still there, helping kids like me. She showed me something she had saved all these years." From his bag, he pulled out an old, tattered drawing, the first one he made after being abandoned. It depicted a small child reaching out to a figure, walking away. For the first time in their conversation, Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he signed. "For years, this drawing symbolized my pain. But now, seeing what you're doing here with Martin and the other children makes me think that maybe, just maybe, people really can change." "I'm not trying to erase the past," Samuel continued. "What you did left a mark on my life that I'll never forget. But watching you work with these kids, especially Martin, it gives me hope. Hope for a fresh start." The dining hall windows were flooded with afternoon sunlight, bathing the scene in a warm, golden glow. Father and son, separated by years of hurt, shared a moment of truth as they truly looked at each other for the first time in decades. "I'm not asking you to call me father," Matthew said softly. "I haven't earned that right. All I'm asking for is the chance to show you that the man who abandoned you no longer exists. I've come to understand albeit too late, the value of unconditional love. Samuel rose and walked to the wall where the children's drawings were displayed. "You know," he began, "every time Teresa told me about your work here, I didn't want to believe you had really changed. I thought it was just your way of seeking redemption. But now, seeing you with these kids, especially Martin, I see something real. Forgiveness," Samuel said, "isn't something you can force. It's like art. It has to flow naturally from the heart." He turned to his father. "I can't promise things will ever be like they should have been, but I'm willing to try to build something new." The dining hall door creaked open, and Martin appeared, having snuck away from the activities outside. "Can I keep drawing?" he asked, shyly. Samuel and Matthew exchanged a glance, then shared their first genuine smile. The three of them settled into the art corner. Samuel picked up a pencil and began to draw, his confident strokes captivating Martin. Matthew watched in awe as his son, the boy he had abandoned over supposed limitations, taught and communicated with a grace that transcended words. "Maybe," Samuel said through his interpreter while sketching, "we could expand the art program here. Make it more formal, with trained instructors." Matthew nodded, understanding that this was Samuel's way of building a bridge between them. As the sun set over the city, Teresa arrived at the dining hall. She stopped at the door, tears welling up as she took in the sight. Samuel and Matthew sitting together, helping Martin with his drawing. The three of them lost in a moment of connection that rose above the past. Art, as Mrs. Rosemary once said, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. In this quiet yet profound moment, shared by Samuel and Matthew, her words had never rung more true. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.